Robots on every corner, sushi for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, samurai, geisha, and workaholics who literally die at their desks. That's how we picture Japan. And nearly every detail of that picture is either a wild exaggeration, a stereotype frozen in the past, or simply untrue. The real Japan is stranger and more fascinating than the postcard. It's a country that lives in the future and the past at the same time. Bullet trains and fax machines humming in the office. Ant-hill cities and villages where 70% of what surrounds you is forest and mountains. Flawless politeness on the street and wild nightlife behind the doors of the bars. Between the Japan of anime and advertising and the real Japan, where more than 100 million people actually live, there's a canyon. Today, we're going to bridge that canyon. I've gathered the 35 most stubborn myths about Japan, the ones the whole world believes, and we'll take them apart, calmly, by the facts. We'll go from the viral stereotypes about sushi and robots to the genuinely surprising. Why the most technological country on Earth still can't give up paper and stamps. Whether it's true there's no crime there, and where the all-powerful Yakuza actually went. Stay with me to the second half. That's where it all flips. 35 myths, one after another. Let's go. Myth number 1. All Japanese people eat sushi every single day. Let's open with the tastiest stereotype, that all of Japan lives on sushi, wolfing it down from morning to night. In reality, for a Japanese person, sushi is more of a special occasion restaurant dish than everyday food. The actual daily Japanese diet is far more varied and simple. The base of the table is rice, miso soup, fish or meat, vegetables, pickles. A huge place is held by dishes foreigners never even think of. Ramen and other noodles, Japanese curry, breaded fried pork tonkatsu, udon and soba noodles, all kinds of donburi, bowls of rice with something on top. On a weekday, a Japanese person is far more likely to grab a cheap bowl of noodles at a stand or a bento from a convenience store than a set of expensive sushi. The history of sushi is telling, too. It didn't start as a delicacy at all, but as a way to preserve fish. The fish was fermented in rice, and the rice itself was often thrown away. The sushi we know, a lump of rice with a slice of fish, was born as street fast food in Tokyo only about 200 years ago, food eaten on the run. And a typical Japanese morning today isn't sushi, but rice with fermented soybeans called natto, miso soup, an egg, pickles, or just toast and coffee. Lunch is a bowl of noodles or curry. Dinner at home is fish or meat with rice and vegetables. In that picture, sushi is a guest for special occasions. So everyone eats sushi every day is a myth. Sushi is the famous showcase of Japanese cuisine, but a Japanese person's everyday life is rice, noodles, soups, and dozens of simple home dishes. And the next myth is about technology, and it'll surprise you twice. Myth number 2. Japan is nothing but robots and cyberpunk on every corner. Thanks to movies and advertising, Japan gets painted as a sci-fi set. Neon streets, talking robots at every doorway, houses from the future. The reality is both close to this and astonishingly far from it. Yes, Japan is one of the world's leaders in robotics. It builds humanoid robots, industrial robots for factories, helper robots. In some hotels, guests really are greeted by robots. In shops, there are talking machines. Tokyo districts like Akihabara or Shinjuku really do glow with neon in the evening, just like in the films. That showcase of the future exists. But everyday Japan is far more down to earth. The average Japanese person doesn't live surrounded by robots. They commute in a packed train, work in an office full of paper documents, shop at small family stores. A huge part of the country is quiet residential neighborhoods and villages that look nothing like cyberpunk. And the contrast inside the country is almost comic. Japan is home to one of the world's largest makers of industrial robots, whose machines assemble products on factory lines across the planet. Here they built the famous humanoid androids paraded before the world. And a couple of hours from neon-lit Akihabara sit dying villages where the average resident is a pensioner, houses stand empty, and the height of technology is an old TV set. Even in Tokyo itself, a clerk who just walked past a robot receptionist heads home to send a document by fax. The showcase of the future and a very analog daily life live side by side in Japan, literally. So, robots and cyberpunk on every corner is a bright showcase, not the whole country. The real Japan is a mix of pinpoint high technology and very ordinary, sometimes old-fashioned daily life. Next, how the Japanese work. Myth number 3. All Japanese people are workaholics who literally work themselves to death. Japan has a stubborn reputation as a country where everyone lives at work, sleeps 3 hours a night, and drops dead from overwork. Here, the myth takes a real and painful problem and inflates it into a universal rule. The honest part? A culture of hard work and overtime really does exist in Japan, and it even has its own grim word, karoshi, death from overwork. This is a real, acknowledged problem. People overworked, stayed at the office late so as not to leave before the boss, took little vacation. You can't deny it. But the image of everyone works themselves to death is outdated and oversimplified. First, karoshi is a tragic extreme, not the fate of everyone. Second, the government and society have long been sounding the alarm and changing things. The state introduced laws capping overtime hours, forced companies to make sure employees take their leave, ran campaigns like Premium Friday, where people get let off early. The whole young generation has grown up, nicknamed the enlightened generation for its deliberate lack of ambition. These kids don't want to live for the company. They value free time. They change jobs easily, and they don't understand why anyone would sit in the office until midnight. The problem of presence sitting, where it's improper to leave before your boss, is still alive, but the ice has cracked, and the old picture of everyone burning out at work no longer describes young Japan. So, all workaholics to the death is a myth grown from a real problem. Overtime and karoshi are real, but there's something the country is fighting, not the norm for every Japanese person. Next, a myth straight out of the action movies. Myth number 4. Every Japanese person knows karate and martial arts. Thanks to the movies, in the popular imagination, any Japanese person is ready at a moment's notice to drop into a stance and scatter opponents with karate or judo moves. The reality is far more mundane. Martial arts really do come from Japan and East Asia. Karate, judo, aikido, kendo, and they're an important part of the culture. Schools may introduce kids to some of them. Judo and kendo are in the curriculum. But the number who truly practice is about the same handful of enthusiasts and athletes as in any other country. For most Japanese, martial arts are something you did as a kid in a club or watch on TV, not a lifelong combat skill. It's worth pinning down the geography of the myth, too. Karate, incidentally, comes not from mainland Japan, but from Okinawa, a southern archipelago with its own culture, and only later spread across the country and the world. Judo became an Olympic sport. Kendo and Aikido are known worldwide, a genuine Japanese contribution. But the truly national spectator sport here is sumo, the ancient wrestling of heavyweights with its rituals and ceremonies, followed by the whole country. And the average Japanese person is more likely to cheer for baseball or football and throw a punch only in a video game. Martial arts are respected and preserved here, but as a sport and a tradition, not a universal skill. So, everyone knows karate is a myth from the action films. Martial arts are a point of Japanese cultural pride, but the ordinary Japanese person fights no better than an ordinary person anywhere else. Next, the most postcard-perfect image of Japan. Myth number 5. Japan is all geisha, samurai, and everyone in kimono. For many, Japan is frozen in an image from old woodblock prints, samurai warriors, mysterious geisha, crowds of people in kimono. It's a beautiful picture, and a hopelessly outdated one. Let's start with the main thing. Samurai haven't existed for a century and a half. The samurai warrior class was abolished back in the 19th century when Japan was rapidly modernizing. Today, samurai live only in films, books, and as a historical symbol. There are, of course, no real samurai on the streets. Geisha aren't what many think either. They aren't women of easy virtue, but highly skilled artists, keepers of the traditional arts of dance, music, and conversation. And very few remain. It's a rare, elite, expensive tradition, concentrated mainly in Kyoto, not a mass phenomenon. A couple of clarifications to make the image crumble for good. The samurai class was formally abolished during the Meiji reforms in the late 19th century, when Japan went from a closed feudal country to a modern power in a matter of decades. So the age of the samurai ended roughly when Europe was building railways and the telegraph. Of geisha, by some estimates, around 1,000 remain, almost all in the old quarters of Kyoto. It's a costly, elite, rare art, not a common sight. And kimono, for modern Japanese, are festive dress for a coming-of-age ceremony, a wedding, or a temple. In summer, at festivals, people wear its light version, the yukata. Otherwise, the street is dressed the same as in any world capital. So, geisha, samurai, and kimono is Japan from a museum and a postcard, not the modern street. The real Japan is dressed in business suits and sneakers. And the next myth is exactly about what genuinely surprises people in Japan. Myth number 6. Japan has smart toilets and vending machines literally on every step. Now here's a rare case where the myth is mostly true and still needs a caveat. Because here, reality actually catches up to the stereotype. Let's start with the machines. There really is a huge number of vending machines in Japan. They stand everywhere, even in remote villages and on mountain trails, and sell not just drinks, but hot food, soups, ice cream, umbrellas, anything. Their density per person is one of the highest in the world, and it's a real, recognizable feature of the country. So this myth mostly checks out. Smart toilets are true too. Japanese toilets with a dozen functions: heated seat, built-in bidet, music, automatic lid, are the norm in homes, hotels, malls, and for visitors, they're one of the biggest culture shocks. Some numbers to grasp the scale. There are millions of vending machines in Japan, one of the world's highest densities per capita. They stand on deserted mountain trails, by temples, in alleys, and they run flawlessly, precisely because in this country, nobody smashes or robs them. Hello to the low crime rate we'll get to later. And the smart toilets with a heated seat, built-in bidet, and a panel of buttons are largely the work of one famous Japanese company that perfected them. For many tourists, their first encounter with such a toilet is more memorable than any tourist attraction. But here's the paradox worth remembering this point for. The country of super smart toilets and ubiquitous machines is at the same time stuck in the paper age in other areas, which we'll cover in a separate myth. Japan's technology is wildly uneven. Where it's about comfort and daily life, it's the future. Where it's about offices and bureaucracy, it's the last century. So, smart toilets and machines everywhere is that rare myth that's mostly true. There's just a paradox hiding behind it, one we'll come back to. Next, the country's geography. Myth number 7. Japan is just Tokyo. For many, Japan boils down to one giant neon metropolis. Tokyo really is enormous, but reducing the whole country to it means missing a large and very different Japan. The Greater Tokyo area is the largest in the world by population, and that really is impressive. But Japan is a whole archipelago of thousands of islands, stretched over an immense distance from north to south with colossal variety. There are other big cities with their own faces. This contrast is worth naming concretely. Osaka, a couple of hours from Tokyo, has a completely different character, its own dialect, a cult of street food, and a reputation as the country's loudest, most fun-loving city. Ancient Kyoto, with its thousands of temples, gardens, and geisha, the former capital. Snowy Hokkaido in the north, with ice sculpture festivals and the best powder snow in the world for skiing. Subtropical Okinawa in the south, with beaches, coral, and its own separate culture and cuisine. And between the cities lies the Japanese heartland, with its problem of emptying houses. Young people leave, aging villages hollow out, and tens of thousands of abandoned homes stand across the country. One country, and inside it, a dozen very different Japans. And the main thing, a huge part of Japan is not the megacities at all. The country is mostly covered in mountains and forests. It's quiet fishing villages, rice fields, hot springs in the mountains, national parks, snow resorts. There's a countryside of aging villages that the young leave for the cities. The rhythm of life in rural Japan is slow, traditional, nothing like Tokyo's bustle. So, Japan is just Tokyo is a myth. Behind the neon metropolis hides a whole country of mountains, forests, villages, temples, and utterly different cities. Next, the character of the Japanese themselves. Myth number 8. The Japanese are cold and unfriendly. Because of their reserve and outward closedness, the Japanese are often taken for a cold, unwelcoming people. Those who've actually dealt with Japanese people and been to the country usually tell a very different story. Start with the fact that Japanese culture is built on politeness and care for the guest. There's even a specific concept, omotenashi, meaning sincere, attentive hospitality with no expectation of reward. Service in Japan is considered among the best in the world precisely because of this attitude. They'll bow to you, help you, see you off, apologize, do everything to make a guest comfortable. A Japanese person might personally walk a lost tourist to the right place, going several blocks with them. The best proof of that care is how Japan treats other people's belongings. It's become almost a legend that a wallet, phone, or bag forgotten in a cafe, on a train, or on the street will very likely be returned to its owner. Found items are handed en masse to the police and lost and found offices, and people deliberately carry other people's things there. Losing something in Japan isn't a disaster, but often a reason to marvel at the locals' honesty. Behind the outwardly reserved behavior lies a deep attentiveness to the other person, and an almost instinctive desire not to cause inconvenience and to help. That is the very care a foreigner at first mistakes for coldness. So, cold and unfriendly is a misreading of Japanese reserve. Behind it is one of the most guest-caring cultures in the world. Next, a direct sequel about emotions. Myth number 9. The Japanese are emotionless robots who don't know how to have fun. Since the Japanese are reserved in public, An image is born of an emotionally cold robot people with neither feelings nor fun. This is probably one of the beliefs furthest from reality. Public reserve in Japan is a cultural norm, not an absence of emotion. On the street, on transit, at work, it's customary to keep yourself in check, not to spill your feelings, not to bother those around you. But that's a mask for public space, not an emptiness inside. The Japanese even have terms for the face shown to society and the true self. They distinguish the public and the personal perfectly well. In fact, this split between the outer and the real has its own names in the culture. Tatemae, the face for society, and hone, the true feelings shown only to those close. It's not hypocrisy, but a way of smoothing relations and preserving harmony. And the Japanese know how to have fun, believe me. Nightlife in Japanese cities is lively. Countless bars and tiny izakaya pubs where colleagues loudly unwind after work. Karaoke, where groups go to sing until morning. Matsuri festivals with dancing, processions, and a sea of emotion. An obsession with video games, anime, pop music. And the true self bursts out precisely at leisure. The Japanese office party at an izakaya, where the strict boss sings karaoke and roars with laughter after a couple of drinks, is a cultural ritual of its own. There are also matsuri, folk festivals, where prim Japanese people haul heavy portable shrines, shout, dance, and drip with sweat from sheer joy. There's an ocean of emotion here. It just has its own time and place. So, emotionless robots is a myth that sees only the reserved public mask. Behind it are emotional people who know how and love to have fun. Next, what the Japanese are supposedly all obsessed with. Myth number 10. All Japanese people are obsessed with anime and manga. Since anime and manga come from Japan and have conquered the world, it seems like every Japanese person must be a fan who lives and breathes cartoons and comics. Reality is more varied. Anime and manga really are a colossal part of Japanese culture and a huge industry. Manga comics are read by people of all ages. It's mainstream, not niche as in the West. On a train, you can see both a school kid and a distinguished adult with a manga or a mobile reader. That's normal and everywhere. And the scale of the industry is hard to overstate. Manga is a huge share of the country's entire book market. Japanese animation has long been a world phenomenon. The studio behind those magical feature films won an Oscar, and its masters sit on the lists of the greatest animation directors on the planet. So anime and manga aren't a kid's pastime or a niche quirk, but an art recognized around the world and a giant export. But everyone's obsessed is an oversimplification. As with any hobby, there are die-hard fans, and there are those who barely watch anime or read manga. A working adult Japanese person with a family may take no interest in the latest anime at all. They have other concerns. What's more, the word otaku, a fan of anime to the point of obsession, long carried a rather negative, mocking tone in Japan itself, unlike the proud "I'm into anime" in the West. In other words, deep obsession with the subculture is exactly the minority, and one that's sometimes teased. So, everyone's obsessed with anime is a myth. Manga and anime are a huge, respected mainstream, but that doesn't mean every Japanese person is a fan. The interest is as varied as with any hobby. Next, language. If you've made it this far, it only gets more interesting. We've cleared away the viral stereotypes about sushi, robots, and samurai. Now, let's look inside. The language, the religion, the nature of the country. And right after that, we dive into the second half, where we crack open Japan's central paradox. Why the country of the future still runs on paper and cash, and what's really going on with money, crime, and the Yakuza. keep going. Myth number 11. Japanese people don't speak any English at all. Japan has a reputation as a country where English is a disaster and you can't make yourself understood. There's some truth to it, but the picture is more complicated and softer than a desperate tourist fears. The honest part? Yes, spoken English is a real weakness for Japan. English is taught in school for many years, but the emphasis was long on grammar and reading rather than living speech. So many Japanese are shy and struggle to speak even when they understand the written word. The average level of spoken English in Japan is lower than in many other developed countries, and it's an acknowledged problem the country is working on. The root of that weakness is largely historical and systemic. Japanese is very far from English in structure, and teaching was built for decades around cramming grammar and passing exams rather than real conversation. Plus, a cultural trait: the fear of making a mistake and losing face, which makes many too shy to speak even when they know the words. But don't speak English at all is an exaggeration, and traveling in Japan is far easier than the scare stories suggest. First, the Japanese are incredibly helpful and will try to assist any way they can. Gestures, the translation app, drawings. A Japanese person who doesn't know English will pull out a phone with a translator, sketch a map, walk you to the spot. Second, the infrastructure is built for guests. Signs, notices, menus, transit are increasingly duplicated in English, especially in cities and tourist areas, and the country was deliberately prepared to receive foreigners before major international events. Third, the younger generation and people in tourism, hotels, and airports speak noticeably better English. So, don't speak English at all is an exaggeration. Spoken English is a real weak point, but the helpfulness of the people and the thoughtful infrastructure make Japan quite friendly to those who don't know Japanese. Next, faith. Myth number 12. All Japanese people are Buddhists and deeply religious. Since Japan has so many temples and religious traditions, it seems like a deeply religious Buddhist country. In fact, the Japanese relationship with religion is nothing like what we're used to. Start with the fact that two main traditions coexist in Japan at once. The ancient native religion Shinto, with its kami spirits and shrines, and the later arriving Buddhism, with its temples. And here's what surprises people. The Japanese don't choose one faith, but calmly use both. There's a sharp saying that a Japanese person is born Shinto, marries Christian, and is buried Buddhist. The same person will go pray at a Shinto shrine for the new year, hold a wedding in a style with Christian elements, and order a Buddhist funeral, and see no contradiction in it. You can see this clearly in the calendar. For the new year, millions of Japanese go to Shinto shrines for the year's first blessing. It's called Hatsumode, and the biggest shrines draw enormous lines. In summer, they mark the Buddhist Obon, a time to honor ancestors. A wedding might be held in a Western, loosely Christian style with a white dress because it's pretty, not out of faith. Across the country, people buy omamori charms for luck, for health, for passing exams. For most, all of this isn't dogma or a weekly service, but pleasant seasonal rituals and part of the cultural fabric of life. Hence the paradox, an ocean of temples and rites, yet few who consider themselves believers in the Western sense. So, all Buddhists and deeply religious is a myth. The Japanese combine Shinto and Buddhism as traditions rather than as faith, and most relate to religion culturally rather than devoutly. Next, the size of the country. Myth number 13. Japan is a tiny country. Because of the image of crowded cities and the fact that Japan is islands, it's often pictured as a small country. This badly underrates its real scale. By area, Japan is no dwarf at all. It's bigger than many European countries, for instance, noticeably larger than Germany or Britain. It's just that a large part of that territory is mountains and forests, unfit for living, so the population is squeezed onto the narrow plains along the coast, which is what creates the sense of endless crowding. But the country itself is long. The Japanese archipelago stretches for thousands of kilometers from north to south, and by population, Japan is a genuine heavyweight. More than 120 million people live here, one of the most populous countries in the world. Economically, it's a giant. For decades, Japan was the second or third economy on the planet and remains one of the largest, the home of automakers, electronics, and brands everyone knows. All of that is the portrait of a great power, not a dot on the map. So, a tiny country is a myth. Japan is bigger in area than it seems, enormous in population, and one of the largest economies in the world. It's a power, not a pipsqueak. Next, the myth that this country supposedly has no nature. Myth number 14. Japan is all concrete and no nature. Because of footage of Tokyo skyscrapers and ant hills, it seems the whole of Japan is an endless city of concrete and neon. The reality is the opposite. Japan is one of the greenest, developed countries in the world. Here's a fact that surprises almost everyone. Around 2/3, and by some estimates up to 70% of Japan's territory is covered in forests and mountains. The country is extraordinarily scenic. Mountain ranges, volcanoes, bamboo groves, waterfalls, rivers, lakes. The famous Mount Fuji is the country's sacred symbol. Hot springs, onsen, are everywhere, where the Japanese go to relax, surrounded by nature. There are national parks, wild coastlines, subtropical jungle on the southern islands, and snowy expanses in the north.
And the Japanese love of nature isn't passive, but active. Onsen, bathing in hot volcanic springs in the open air, often amid snow or forest, are a whole national culture of relaxation. There are even monkeys that warm themselves the same way in the hot springs, and shots of these bathing the cacks have gone around the world. There's sacred Mount Fuji, climbed by tens of thousands of pilgrims and tourists. There are seasonal rituals of admiration. Cherry blossoms in spring, crimson maples in autumn, snow in winter, fireflies, and the sea in summer. The entire Japanese aesthetic is built on the turning of the seasons and attention to nature. So Tokyo's concrete is just a narrow rim of a country that is mostly green and mountainous. So all concrete and no nature is a myth. Japan is mostly covered in forests and mountains, and is one of the most naturally rich, developed countries. Next, earthquakes. Myth number 15. Japan has constant earthquakes, and everything collapses. Japan is known as a country of earthquakes, and out of that grows the image of a place where the ground shakes endlessly, and buildings keep tumbling down. The first part is close to true. The second is not. The honest part. Japan really does sit in one of the most seismically active regions on the planet, at the junction of tectonic plates. Earthquakes here really are frequent, but the vast majority are weak, barely perceptible tremors that locals hardly notice. Strong, destructive earthquakes do happen, and the country has lived through real tragedies, including catastrophic quakes and tsunamis. The danger is real. It can't be denied. But everything collapses is wrong, and here's why. Precisely because Japan lives with this threat, it has become a world leader in earthquake-resistant construction. You can see how seriously they take it in the details. Skyscrapers in Tokyo are built on special shock absorbers and dampers, so that in a quake the building sways smoothly, dissipating energy rather than cracking. TVs and phones get an automatic emergency alert seconds before the wave reaches the city. Those seconds are enough to stop trains and elevators and take cover. Drills are held regularly in schools and offices. The Japanese live with earthquakes all their lives and treat weak tremors as routine.
It's this long conditioning that makes the country the benchmark. Where a catastrophe would destroy an unprepared country, Japan most often stands firm. So, everything constantly collapses is a myth.
Earthquakes are frequent, and the threat is real. But that's exactly why Japan is the world's benchmark for readiness and quake-resistant construction. Next, the most romantic image of Japan. Myth number 16. Japan is drowning in cherry blossoms year-round. Pink trees to the horizon are Japan's calling card, and out of that grows the image of a country forever wrapped in blooming cherry. In fact, it's one of the most fleeting sights on Earth. The cherry blossom isn't a permanent state of the country, but a very brief event. In any given spot, the cherry blooms for only about a week and a half at most, and then the petals fall. That very fleetingness is what makes it so precious to the Japanese. The brevity of the beauty, its quick fading, is a whole philosophy, a symbol of the fragility and transience of life. Admiring the cherry blossoms, hanami, is a ritual for which people go out to the parks for picnics during exactly those few days it blooms, and the bloom rolls across the country in a wave. In Japan, people track the blossom front like the weather. The meteorological services put out maps and forecasts of when the cherry will open in each region, and people plan their hanami picnics by them. The very philosophy of a fleeting beauty that is beautiful precisely because it's momentary has its own name, mono no aware, the pathos of the transience of things. Falling petals for a Japanese person are a metaphor for life itself, and in autumn the country changes into a no less beautiful outfit. Momiji, crimson and gold maples, hunted with cameras just as the cherry is in spring. So a blooming Japan is 2 short seasons a year, not an eternal postcard. So cherry blossoms year-round is a myth. The cherry bloom is a short, precious flash, a week or a week and a half long, not a permanent view, and its fleetingness is the whole point. And now, the very paradox it was worth staying for. Myth number 17. Japan is the most digital, most advanced country in the world, ahead of everyone. We've already seen the smart toilets and robots, and it seems logical. If Japan is this futuristic in daily life, it must have outpaced the world in everything else. And here lies the country's central paradox, one that stuns almost everyone. The reality is that in many areas, Japan is astonishingly stuck in an analog past. The famous example is fax machines. They're still used en masse in offices, government agencies, and even hospitals, while the rest of the world has all but forgotten them. Paper and personal hanko seals still play a huge role. Instead of a signature, documents are certified with the imprint of a personal seal, and that stalls digitization. Just how serious it is shows in details that have become anecdotes. Only a few years ago, some government agencies officially accepted data on floppy disks, those square ones from the 90s, and only recently finally gave them up. Cash is still hugely in use. In many places, a card won't be accepted, and the Japanese carry a wallet of bills, though super trains run nearby. The personal hanko seal was long mandatory in place of a signature, stalling any move to digital. Realizing how far behind it had fallen, the country even created a separate digital agency to drag itself out of the paper age. And at the same time, yes, the same Japan leads in robotics, makes the world's best cameras and optics, and built the legendary Shinkansen bullet trains, which for decades have run to the second and almost without a single fatal accident. There it is, the Japanese paradox in full. The country of super trains and smart toilets that, at the same time, can't part with the fax and the seal. So, the most digital country, ahead of everyone, is a myth with a huge caveat. Japan is a world leader in some technologies and a surprising laggard in others, especially in digital paperwork. Technology here is wildly uneven. Quick pause. Be honest in the comments. How many of these 17 myths did you believe yourself? Half of viewers are sure of at least 5. And from here it's the second half, where we'll tackle the most interesting stuff about modern Japan. Whether everything really is insanely expensive, whether all is well with this economic giant, where the all-powerful Yakuza went, and whether Japan has any crime at all. This is what it was worth staying for. Let's keep going. Myth number 18. Everything in Japan is insanely expensive. Japan has a reputation as a country where prices bite, and an ordinary tourist or resident can't afford anything. Reality is far more flexible. Japan can be very different in price, and it's often cheaper than expected. Yes, the expensive side of Japan exists. High-end restaurants, gift-wrapped melons for hundreds of dollars, pricey taxis, rent in central Tokyo. But alongside it, there's a very affordable Japan. You can eat cheaply. A bowl of ramen, a gyudon rice bowl with beef, a konbini bento from a 24-hour store cost pennies and are tasty and good quality at that. There are 100-yen shop chains where almost everything sells at a fixed low price. There are affordable clothing chains born in Japan that conquered the world. The secret of the affordable Japan is in price stagnation and a weak currency. Because prices and wages in the country have barely risen for decades, and the yen has weakened in recent years, for a visitor with dollars or euros, Japan has become a surprisingly good value destination. A filling lunch for a couple of dollars, cheap yet high-quality goods in the 100-yen shops and in those world-conquering Japanese clothing chains. What stays expensive is maybe rent in central Tokyo and those fancy gift fruits like perfect melons for hundreds of dollars. But that's the top shelf of the showcase, not the everyday life most Japanese and travelers actually live. So, everything is insanely expensive is a myth. Japan has both an expensive showcase and a very affordable everyday life. And in recent years, it has even turned out to be unexpectedly cheap for many foreigners. Next, the economy as a whole. Myth number 19. Japan is a problem-free economic giant. Japan is associated with wealth, quality, and technology, from which grows the image of a flawless, ever-prosperous economy without a care. Reality is far more complex, and the Japanese economy has serious chronic problems. Japan really did rise after the war to the status of an economic miracle and become one of the largest economies in the world. That's true. But then, from the early 90s, came what's called the lost decades. After a huge financial bubble burst, the country got stuck for many years in stagnation, almost no growth, with deflation, where prices and wages barely moved for decades. Japan is still climbing out of that hole. Add to that the main affliction, demographics, which is worth grasping in numbers because it's the country's central drama. Already about a third of Japanese are over 65, and the share of the elderly is growing. The birth rate is one of the lowest in the world, and the population is shrinking by hundreds of thousands a year. Schools are closing across the country, villages are emptying, there aren't enough working hands. On top of that, Japan has one of the largest government debts in the world relative to the size of its economy. All of this is the heavy legacy of the financial bubble that burst in the early 90s and the lost decades of near-zero growth that followed. So behind the showcase of automakers and skyscrapers hides a country seriously puzzling over who will work and support the elderly tomorrow. So, a problem-free giant is a myth. Japan is wealthy and developed, but with chronic stagnation, rapid aging, and enormous debt. It's a giant with heavy problems. Next, a direct sequel, personal wealth. Myth number 20. All Japanese people are rich. Since Japan is a wealthy, developed country, it seems like all Japanese must live in prosperity. Reality is more uneven, and behind the average well-being hide plenty of nuance.
Japan is a country with a high standard of living, developed infrastructure, safety, and quality medicine. And on the whole, it's a prosperous society with a large middle class. That's true. But everyone's rich is an oversimplification. Because of those very lost decades, wages in Japan barely rose for a long time. And in income, the country fell behind a number of other developed states over that period. A large share of workers ended up on unstable temporary contracts with low pay and no guarantees. A big social problem. The problem of unstable employment is especially telling. A noticeable share of Japanese workers today are employed not on the lifetime contract of the legendary era, but on temporary, subcontracted terms, with lower pay and no security. And breaking out of that category into a stable one can be very hard.
Hence the hidden poverty a tourist won't see. The elderly forced to work in old age on a modest pension, single mothers, young people living in tiny apartments on unsteady income. The middle class in Japan is large, and outwardly all is well, but wages have stood still for 30 years, and inequality is quietly rising. Wealth here is more a legacy of the bubble 80s than the reality of today. So, all Japanese are rich is a myth. Japan is a prosperous country with a large middle class, but with stagnant wages, growing inequality, and hidden poverty. Wealth here is far from evenly spread. Next, whether Japan even lets people in. Myth number 21. Japan is closed to foreigners. You can barely get in. Japan has a reputation as a closed, inward-looking country that's hard to get into and where outsiders aren't welcome. In terms of tourism, that hasn't been true for a long time. On the contrary, Japan is going through a genuine tourism boom. Getting into Japan today is easy. Citizens of many countries have visa-free entry for tourist trips, and the country actively courts guests. The scale of the tourism boom is impressive. Even before the pandemic, Japan reached tens of millions of foreign visitors a year, set a goal of growing the flow further, and after restrictions lifted, the tourists poured back in, spurred by the cheap yen. In ancient Kyoto, it has even reached over-tourism, residents complaining about the crowds at the temples and in the narrow geisha lanes. Immigration and living there long-term is another matter. Here, Japan has historically been fairly closed. Citizenship is hard to get. Society long remained ethnically homogeneous, and permanent migrants were regarded with reserve. But even this is changing. Because of aging and a labor shortage, Japan is forced to open up, attracting foreign workers, and the number of foreigners living in the country is growing. So the closedness is slowly giving way to demographic necessity. The country is opening work programs, the foreign population is rising, and the insularity is retreating before the shortage of hands. So Japan is closed, you can't get in, is a myth, especially for a tourist. The country is in a tourism boom and gladly receives guests. The insularity survives more in matters of long-term immigration, but even that is melting. Next, food again. Myth number 22. Japanese food is just sushi. We started with sushi, but it's worth returning. Outside Japan, the whole cuisine is often reduced to sushi and rolls. Yet this is one of the richest, most varied cuisines in the world, where sushi is just one chapter. Real Japanese gastronomy is a whole universe. Ramen, the cult noodle in a rich broth with dozens of regional variants. Tempura, an airy batter fry. Tonkatsu, crispy breaded pork. Japanese curry, nothing like Indian, thick and slightly sweet, a beloved home food. Gyoza, dumplings. Okonomiyaki, a Japanese pancake pizza. Takoyaki, octopus balls. Nabe, hot pots. Yakitori, grilled skewers. Unagi, eel. A culture all its own is the izakaya, Japanese pubs with dozens of small dishes to go with a drink. It's worth emphasizing the philosophy of this cuisine, the thing it's prized for. At the heart of Japanese food is a cult of seasonality and freshness. A dish should reflect the time of year, and an ingredient should reveal its natural taste rather than drown in sauces. Hence the haute cuisine of kaiseki, hours-long meals of a succession of tiny seasonal dishes calibrated like a work of art, and the famous marbled Wagyu beef that melts in your mouth, and a whole world of delicate wagashi sweets for tea. It's no accident that Japanese cuisine, washoku, was placed on the list of humanity's intangible cultural heritage, not for sushi alone, but for this whole approach to food as an aesthetic and a respect for the ingredient. So, just sushi is a myth. Japanese cuisine is one of the world's great cuisines, where ramen, tempura, curry, wagyu, and dozens of other dishes are no less important than sushi. Next, how the Japanese eat. Myth number 23. Japanese people eat only with chopsticks and only raw fish. Two stereotypes in one, that the Japanese all eat exclusively with chopsticks and live mostly on raw fish. Both are only half true. Chopsticks really are the main utensil, mastered from childhood, but not the only one. Many dishes are eaten differently. Curry and some rice dishes with a spoon, Western dishes with a fork and knife, some things by hand. It's worth saying a bit more about chopstick etiquette because there's a culture behind it. Both main taboos are tied to funerals. Chopsticks stuck upright in rice recall the ritual of offering to the dead, and passing food chopstick to chopstick is a rite with bones after cremation, so both are considered bad omens at the table. You also shouldn't point chopsticks at people or food or wave them around. Meanwhile, the Japanese happily eat curry and many rice dishes with a spoon, Western food with a fork and knife, and sip soup straight from the bowl. Now, raw fish. Yes, sashimi and sushi with fresh fish are an important and beloved part of the cuisine, and the Japanese eat a lot of fish. But only raw fish is a strong exaggeration. A huge part of Japanese food is boiled, fried, stewed, grilled, and steamed. Meat, especially pork and chicken, holds a big place in the diet, along with vegetables, noodles, soups, rice. Japanese cuisine is far from only raw seafood. So, only chopsticks and only raw fish is a doubly wrong myth. Chopsticks are the main, but not the only, utensil, and raw fish is only one part of a rich and mostly cooked diet. Next, a far more contentious myth. Myth number 24. All Japanese people eat whales and dolphins. From the loud news about whaling, an image formed that all of Japan eats whale and dolphin meat wholesale. Reality is much narrower than that image. The subject really is sensitive and real. Japan has waged and still wages disputes over whaling, which draws international criticism, and in certain coastal places a hunting tradition exists. That's true, and it's a painful issue. But to imagine that whale meat is the everyday food of all Japanese is completely wrong. The numbers and context matter for balance. After the war, in the hungry years, whale briefly became a mass, cheap source of protein. They even fed it to kids at school. But as prosperity grew, its consumption collapsed, and today makes up a negligible share of the country's diet. Japan at one point loudly withdrew from the International Whaling Commission and resumed limited commercial hunting in its own waters, which brought a wave of criticism, a real and painful theme. But demand is falling, even domestically. Stockpiles of unsold meat are growing, and young people are indifferent to it. So this isn't a nation of whale eaters, but a fading niche tradition against the backdrop of a big argument. So everyone eats whales and dolphins is a myth. The subject of whaling is real and contentious, but for the vast majority of Japanese, whale meat is an exotic thing they almost never eat.
Next, discipline. Myth number 25. Japanese people never break the rules. They're perfectly disciplined. The Japanese have a reputation as a nation benchmark of order. Nobody litters, everyone queues, every rule is followed to the letter. There's a lot of truth in this, but the image of perfect robots of order is still embellished. The honest and pleasant part. Japanese society really is very orderly. The streets are astonishingly clean, even though there are almost no bins. People carry their trash with them. People queue in disciplined lines, don't shove on transit, keep quiet on trains, follow unspoken norms of behavior. This is a real cultural trait, one that prizes not causing others inconvenience. The famous example of this discipline is the cleaning. At stadiums after matches, Japanese fans collect their own trash, and the players leave the locker room spotless. And it amazes the whole world every time. In schools, children clean their own classrooms. There are almost no bins on the streets, yet there's no litter either. It's carried home. All of this is real and wonderful, but there are no perfect societies, and Japan is no exception. People break rules, just more quietly and in the private sphere. Behind the facade of perfect order is ordinary human life. There are corruption scandals among politicians and corporations, tax evasion, petty violations. Japan's famous discipline is largely about public behavior and social pressure, not about the Japanese being incapable of breaking rules. Behind closed doors and out of others' sight, everything is much more ordinary. So, never break the rules is an idealization. Japanese society really is remarkably orderly in public space, but there are no flawless people without violations here either. Next, a direct sequel. Crime. Myth number 26. There's no crime in Japan at all. Continuing the image of perfect order, there's a myth that Japan is a country with no crime whatsoever. It really is exceptionally safe, but none at all is an idealization.
The truth is that Japan is one of the safest countries in the world, and that's not PR. The level of street violent crime here is extremely low. People walk the cities calmly deep at night. Children ride the subway to school on their own. A wallet forgotten in a cafe will very likely be returned to its owner. Lost items are handed to lost and found offices en masse and returned. This sense of safety is one of the things that most astonishes the country's guests.
But crime exists. It's just different and less visible. The very forms of Japanese crime are telling. One of the main scourges is phone fraud targeting the elderly. Scammers call and, pretending to be a relative in trouble, extract huge sums from old people. Whole campaigns are launched to fight it. There's the problem of groping in rush-hour-packed trains, which is why women-only cars appeared. There's cybercrime and financial fraud. In other words, crime hasn't vanished. It's simply moved almost off the street into less visible spheres. But street-level, everyday safety in Japan is phenomenal. A 7-year-old rides the subway to school alone, and it frightens no one. There are even TV shows built on it. So, no crime at all is an idealization. Japan is one of the safest countries on the planet, but not crime-free. Crime here is low and shifted into invisible spheres. And now, the promised myth about the Yakuza. Myth number 27.
The Yakuza rule the country. The mafia is everywhere.
Thanks to the movies, the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, are imagined as an all-powerful shadow power gripping the whole country. Reality is far more prosaic, and today it's largely a fading thing. The Yakuza really do exist, and were long an unusual phenomenon. semi-legal organized crime groups that were publicly known, that had offices, signs, even magazines, and dealt in racketeering, gambling, construction, financial schemes. It's part of Japan's real history. But rule the country is a strong exaggeration even for their heyday, and how sharp the reversal was shows in the numbers. Over the past decades, the authorities passed special laws against organized groups and exclusion ordinances under which businesses, banks, and landlords are directly forbidden to deal with the Yakuza. A group member can be refused an apartment rental, a bank account, even a mobile contract. As a result, the number of Yakuza has plummeted from tens of thousands to far more modest figures, and keeps melting away. The ranks are aging. The young don't join. Not long ago, groups had offices with signs and their own magazines. Today, it's a phenomenon driven into the shadows and dying out, living far more in films and TV series than on the actual streets. So, the Yakuza rule the country is a doubly outdated myth. Organized crime was a notable phenomenon, but it never ruled the country, and today is rapidly fading under the pressure of the law.
8 myths left, and they'll fill in the whole picture. About Japanese women, attitudes toward foreigners, work, and whether this country is frozen in time. If you've made it this far, you already understand Japan better than 9 people out of 10. Let's push to the end. Myth number 28. Japanese women are submissive and powerless. Out of old stereotypes and movie images comes a picture of the Japanese woman as a silent, submissive shadow of a man. Reality is more complex and noticeably more modern than that image. Start with the honest part. Gender inequality in Japan is a real and acknowledged problem. In international equality rankings, the country stands low for a developed nation. Few women in leadership and politics, a persistent wage gap, and traditional expectations that a woman will take on home and children are still strong. It would be dishonest to gloss over this.
But the image of submissive and powerless is outdated and unfair. The gap between the numbers and daily life is telling. In the international gender equality rankings, Japan stands unusually low for a developed country, primarily because there are extremely few women in top posts in business and politics, and because of the wage gap. That's a real, acknowledged problem. But at the everyday level, a Japanese woman has more power than it seems. In the family, it's traditionally the wife who holds the budget and manages the money, while the husband gets a monthly allowance from her. Women work en masse, drive, travel, and world-famous Japanese women writers, artists, and entrepreneurs have long refuted the image of the silent shadow. The old roles are changing, if more slowly than many would like. So the truth is double. Real gender inequality that can't be ignored, and, at the same time, educated, working, independent women, not silent shadows. Submissive and powerless is definitely not the modern Japanese woman. Next, the attitude toward outsiders. Myth number 29. Japanese people are secret racists who hate foreigners. There's also the opposite extreme to the friendliness myth, that behind Japanese politeness hides a cold hostility toward all outsiders. Reality is subtler and comes down neither to everyone adores foreigners nor everyone hates them. Let's sort it out honestly. The root here isn't hatred but centuries of homogeneity and the concept of the inner circle. Japan was for centuries an almost closed mono-ethnic country, and the division into us and outsiders, gaijin, runs deep in the culture. A foreigner, even after many years, can feel politely kept at a distance, hence certain painful things. Somewhere they might not rent an apartment to a foreigner. Here and there hang Japanese-only signs, and newcomers sometimes feel like eternal guests who will never be fully accepted as one's own. These are real things, and foreigners living in Japan speak of them honestly.
But hate is a strong and wrong word. In the overwhelming majority of everyday encounters, the Japanese treat a foreigner with curiosity, courtesy, and a readiness to help, not with hostility. What's sometimes taken for hidden dislike more often turns out to be reserve, a language barrier, a fear of doing something wrong, or simply unfamiliarity. It's cultural closedness and caution rather than hatred. And under the pressure of demographics, with ever more newcomers arriving, the younger generation is noticeably more open than their elders. So, secret racists who hate foreigners is an exaggeration. There's real cultural closeness and some genuine problems, but not hatred. More often, it's polite reserve rather than hostility. Next to last, work and life again. Myth number 30. Japanese people have no personal life, only work. Out of the workaholic myth grows the image of the Japanese person as a function with nothing but the office. No hobbies, no family, no rest. It's a caricature that erases a whole layer of life. Yes, work holds a big place in Japanese lives, and we've spoken honestly about overtime. But reducing a Japanese person to work alone means not noticing everything else. And into their hobbies, the Japanese pour a signature depth. A hobby here is often taken to the level of art. A collector assembles his subject down to the last detail. A train buff knows everything about every line. A coffee lover perfects his brew for years. Whole districts and shops are devoted to the narrowest interests, from miniature models to retro games. Plus, a developed leisure culture. Trips to hot springs, theme parks, hiking, cycling tours, seasonal festivals, of which there are dozens on the calendar. There's family life, too. Travel, trips around the country and the world. Seasonal holidays and festivals, of which the Japanese calendar has many. The younger generation increasingly values the balance between work and personal life, and is ever less willing to dissolve into the company without remainder, demanding the very balance their elders never even thought to fight for. So a Japanese person's life is far from just the office. So only work and no personal life is a caricature myth. Work matters, but the Japanese have a rich world of hobbies, leisure, and family, and the new generation values personal life more and more. And now the final block of myths about whether this country is frozen or changing. Myth number 31. All Japanese people are short. The stereotype of uniformly short Japanese people has lived on since the old days, but it too is largely outdated, because over the last century the Japanese have grown noticeably taller. The truth is that the average height of the Japanese really was low, but that's largely a consequence of past nutrition, not some unchanging trait. The cause of the height surge is above all food. While the diet was meager and rested mainly on rice and fish, people grew modestly. When, after the war, meat, milk, bread, and varied protein firmly entered the menu, the next generations literally shot up. The difference between a grandfather and grandson can be a whole head. This is one of the world's clearest examples of the fact that height depends not on breed, but on nutrition and living conditions. Today, the average height of the Japanese already differs little from that of many Europeans, and there are plenty of tall young people to spare in the Tokyo crowd. The image of uniformly miniature Japanese is more a picture from the past than today's reality. So, all short is an outdated myth. The average height of the Japanese has risen noticeably over the century, following the improvement in nutrition, and the young generation is no more miniature than many others. Next, whether Japan changes at all. Myth number 32. Japan is frozen and never changes. There are two opposite myths about Japan. One, that it forever races into the future, the other, that it's frozen forever in tradition. And the second is just as wrong as the first. Japan changes, and sometimes dramatically. It's enough to recall how sharply Japan can change when it has to. In the mid-19th century, it was a tightly closed feudal country of samurai. And in just a few decades of reforms, it built factories, an army, a navy, a parliament, and turned into a modern power. Few in history have managed such a leap. After the war, another rebirth into a peaceful economic miracle. Now, a third great transformation is underway, forced by demographics. Lifetime employment at one company is eroding. The role of women in the economy is slowly rising. The country is reluctantly opening to migrants, and at last taking up digitization. Culture is changing too. The young generation lives differently from their parents, relates differently to work, marriage, children, traditions. Yes, Japan carefully preserves its heritage, and that's its strength. But preserving traditions and freezing are different things. Under the layer of continuity, there's constant motion. Japan doesn't stand still. It simply changes in its own way, cautiously on the outside and powerfully in essence, while carefully keeping its heritage. So, frozen and never changes is a myth. Japan has lived through several complete rebirths and is changing right now under the pressure of demographics and a new generation, all while preserving its heritage. Next, the myth that confuses Japan with its neighbors. Myth number 33. Japan, China, and Korea are basically the same thing. For many on the other side of the world, East Asia blurs into a single mass. Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, all the same. This is a crude mistake that erases three very different civilizations. Start with the languages. Japanese, Chinese, and Korean are completely different languages, not mutually intelligible and belonging to different families. Yes, the Japanese historically borrowed Chinese characters for writing, but the language itself, the grammar, the sound, is their own. It's worth clarifying the writing, too, since it's the source of the confusion. The Japanese did borrow Chinese characters, called kanji, but on top of that, they invented two syllabic alphabets of their own, which neither the Chinese nor the Koreans have, and write in a mix of all three. The Koreans, for their part, switched entirely to their own original alphabet, Hangul. So even in writing, these are different systems. The religions differ, the cuisines, the architecture, the customs, the character of the societies. Behind each of the three countries lies its own millennia-old history and its own separate identity, which they cherish deeply. What's more, relations among these countries have historically been difficult, with wars, occupations, and mutual grievances whose memory is alive to this day and still flares up in politics. So for the Japanese, Chinese, and Koreans themselves, the idea that they're the same thing sounds about like telling a European that Germans, French, and Italians are indistinguishable. A distant observer's impression of similar facial features doesn't change the fact that these are three proud, very different, and sometimes rival civilizations. So Japan, China, and Korea are the same is a myth. These are three separate civilizations with their own languages, cultures, histories, and uneasy relations with one another. Next to last, the very essence of Japan. Myth number 34. The real Japan is only ancient traditions. Lovers of Japan sometimes fall into a romantic extreme. The real Japan is tea ceremonies, temples, the samurai spirit, and old crafts, while everything modern is somehow not real. This is as one-sided as the opposite cyberpunk image. Ancient traditions in Japan really are alive and carefully preserved. The tea ceremony, calligraphy, temples, martial arts, crafts, no and kabuki theater, seasonal customs. It's an enormous value and part of the national code. But reducing the real Japan to them means missing a whole living modern culture that, for today's Japanese, is no less authentic. The real Japan is both the ancient temple and the neon district next to it. both the tea ceremony and the global industry of anime, video games, pop music, both the kimono on holidays and Tokyo street fashion setting trends for the whole world. The scale of Japan's modern cultural export is hard to overstate. Japanese video games and game consoles conquered the planet. Japanese electronics and car brands are known to everyone. Japanese street fashion from Tokyo sets world trends, and Japanese cinema and animation collect prizes at the biggest festivals. This country's directors sit on the lists of the greatest in history. All of it was created not 100 years ago, but today. And for a young Japanese person, it's as authentic a culture as the tea ceremony was for their great-grandfather.
That's exactly why the most honest definition of Japan is both at once. The ancient temple with a game arcade glowing around the corner, and the kimono worn to take a photo on the latest smartphone. So the real Japan is only traditions is as one-sided a myth as only futurism. The real Japan is a living unity of the ancient and the ultra-modern. And now, the last, 35th myth, the most flattering and therefore the most deceptive. Myth number 35. Japan is a perfect country, a utopia without problems. The internet is also home to the opposite of all the scare stories. Japan as a perfect utopia where everything is flawless, clean, polite, and runs like clockwork. Japan is loved for this, but this image too is a myth. Just a pleasant one.
Yes, there's much to learn from Japan. And much here really is wonderful. The safety, cleanliness, service, quality, politeness, order, food, nature, the richest culture. All of it is real and the admiration is deserved. But behind the glossy facade are those serious problems we've spoken about honestly. The rapid aging and shrinking of the population, decades of economic stagnation, an enormous national debt, the culture of overwork, gender inequality, loneliness and social isolation, and the enormous pressure of society on the individual to conform to norms. That downside has its own bitter names. There's the phenomenon of hikikomori, people who, for years, don't leave their room, having buckled under the pressure of society and expectation. There's the problem of lonely deaths, kodokushi, when an elderly person dies alone and isn't found for some time. In an aging and ever more atomized society, that's a growing tragedy. There's the heavy psychological strain of always having to fit in, not stand out, not let the group down. All of it is the price of that very famous order and harmony. There are no perfect utopias anywhere, and Japan is no exception. It's a remarkable, in many ways admirable country, and at the same time a country with heavy, real challenges. And it's in this blend of light and shadow, not in the glossy picture, that the real Japan lies. So, a perfect utopia without problems is a myth, the most pleasant of all. Japan is admirable in many ways, and at the same time carries the heavy weight of real problems, like any living country. 35 myths behind us, and if they share one common root, it sounds like this. Almost every one takes a single vivid detail, sushi, a robot, a samurai, a workaholic, and passes it off as the whole country. We judge Japan by anime, advertising, and postcards, and we almost always miss the 100+ million living, perfectly ordinary people. The real Japan turns out to be stranger, more contradictory, and more human than any cliché. It's a country that lives in the future and the past at once, obsessed with toilets but unable to part with the facts, flawlessly polite on the street and letting loose behind the doors of the bars, astonishing in its order and suffering from its own pressure. Neither cyberpunk, nor a museum, nor a utopia,
but a living, complex society far more interesting than any stereotype.
So the next time someone confidently tells you some well-known thing about